Today I'm going to try to draw these rooftops in Tallinn, Estonia, and I'm set up in the Danish garden, or Danish King's Garden, which sits on the southwest side of the old town on the edge of Tumpea Hill, which I'm more than likely mispronouncing. Sorry, Estonian is hard. From this vantage point, you can see the back of this row of quaint buildings with St. Nicholas Church behind them, towering overhead. This is an incredibly popular viewpoint in Tallinn, but even when it's full of people, there always seems to be enough room to get a spot for yourself, for which I'm thankful, because some of the other viewpoints here would make this setup impossible throughout most any day of the week. I chose this reference and knew of its existence because I've taken pretty much this exact photo like 100 times. The light can vary pretty wildly here, so it's a nice spot to revisit photographically, which I felt would translate to drawing, and I was right. I find this to be a satisfying composition with the tower terminating somewhere out of frame, which speaks to its height and significance, and these tall and slender buildings with their orangey red rooftops make for a charming foundation. The scene is a pretty flat one since everything is fairly distant, but there are still some interesting angles here, along with a few perspective puzzles I'll need to work out along the way. The first thing I'll say about drawing this is that I had a hard time figuring out where to start. Scenes like these, where everything feels equally significant, can make it confusing to make that first mark. I spent a few minutes in my pocket sketchbook testing out where I should begin, and originally, when I walked up to the scene, I figured I'd start with the church. When you're standing here, it has this commanding presence, and it immediately draws your attention upward. But as soon as I started sketching it out, I realized how much of a mess I could make with how much space it could take up on the paper, pushing those buildings at the bottom even lower. And the area specifically where it makes contact with those buildings might have been confusing, going from the top down with all those angles. Funny enough, none of these buildings actually touch the tower despite looking like it. They're actually across a street from it. But that just goes to show how purposefully flat this composition is and just how imposing that tower is in the background. Anyway, I went through another iteration or two of quick sketches before ultimately deciding to start with that building in the bottom right. It's closest to me by far, so nothing overlaps, and it probably has the simplest of all the rooftops as well. On the topic of my pocket sketchbook, these iterations that I'm talking about are very quick sketches, and I'd hesitate to even call them that. They're more like doodles. I try to do these before every drawing, so I have a basic idea of the order of operations and the overall composition. So in the case of this reference, I quickly sketched all of the rooftops, vaguely marked where some windows would go, and tried to remember which buildings came after which. I don't get much data as far as details or textures are concerned, and even in the case of perspective, I keep things so loose that any specific information I might glean from the sketch goes out the window by the time I start the real, quote unquote, real drawing. My approach to these practice runs is to make small thumbnail sketches, and mine are really not much bigger than my actual thumbnail. It's a good way for me to get my bearings, but because I make them so small, it can be somewhat jarring to transition to this larger version. Both my drawing area and my sketchbook are much larger than what I practice in, so I'm sure you can see how that would be strange. That said, I don't really want to spend any more of my time figuring it out because to some degree, that's what you're watching. I'm not completely prepared for every mark I'm going to make in these videos. I'm figuring a lot of it out in real time, which offers a better representation of my process than if I were to decide everything beforehand, at least in my opinion. The drawings themselves might be better because of it, but I think the videos could very well lose some authenticity in the process if I was to spend more time in the beginning. Jumping back into the perspective a bit, it gives me some problems here. I've started to feel more and more comfortable with winging things regarding perspective. I don't really map anything out. I tend to just observe the scene and try my best to intuit my way through it. But I've also fallen into this little trap of staring too long at what I've drawn instead of reassessing the reference. So, for example, this central left building, the light blue one, really had me confused at one point. Before I drew the windows, what I saw on the paper was just its peaked facade that could ostensibly connect to the right or left rooftop, especially since the height of these are really close to being even. They're all right about eye level. So when I was ready to draw in its windows, without looking back at the reference, stupidly, depending on which roof connected to that facade, the right side or the left side, that would change which direction it faces, which would change the perspective, which would change the angle of the windows. This honestly flippant mistake confused me over and over again throughout this drawing, and you might notice that I go over those windows a few times. By the end, they are facing the correct direction, angled down toward the center, which, even as I say that, kind of confuses me a little. But they only look that way thanks to some added details. The mistake kind of gets hidden under some extra lines, which gets on my nerves, but it is what it is. I'm just glad I finally figured it out. And quickly, it's something I've said 1,000 times, but man, it can be so unexpectedly hard to figure things like that out when you're staring at the actual scene in real life. Photographs are so much simpler to understand. Anyway, even though this reference threw me for a loop a few times, it was still, on the whole, an enjoyable experience. These rooftops look complex, or at least they do to me, but like I mentioned, figuring them out was like solving a puzzle, and it ended up being a lot of fun. Trying to understand the angles, marking where each one would start and end, it was just a good time, and I'm glad I stuck with it even when it got a little frustrating. All that aside, to once again bring up this new pen, I noticed today how I can still find ways to implement my hesitant lines. The marks are still a lot more final and decisive than they were with the ballpoint pen, but I'm catching myself sketching lightly, hesitantly, and I have to get past that. Again, this drawing was a bit of a puzzle, so I did have to explore my way around a bit. But even after I knew where something would go, I'd barely commit to it, and I kind of hate that. For what it's worth, it's a good thing I did for the sake of the wonky window perspective thing, but I'd so much rather fully grasp what I'm planning to do and just use dots to mark where I'm about to draw, like a tiny failsafe, rather than timidly graze the pen over the paper. It never looks nice, and I have to go back over the lines anyway, which can look bad in its own way. So I'd really, truly love to stop that. I do think this pen will help. It probably already has to some extent, so I'm grateful of that. But it's just proof that I'm too in my head, and I think that shows on the paper. Aside from that, something I'm happy I did here was add those vertical lines to the rooftops. It doesn't look realistic necessarily, but it does help to inform their direction. I was noticing that all those flat surfaces kind of blended together, and I wanted a way to differentiate them. The obvious choice, the one that I was desperate to avoid, would be to draw the tiles themselves. That way I'd get the direction as well as some texture, but that almost definitely would have looked horrible. Unless I sat there and took my time, carefully, painstakingly following each and every tile, I think I would have fallen into the same trap as I have in the past, whereby implying those tiles, I actually make them even more ambiguous. By using these vertical lines, it's still not perfectly clear what the roofs are made of, but at least it doesn't look like brick or straw or some other material. It's kind of a win-win. Also, there we have yet another thing I probably learned from Stephen Travers. Those vertical lines. What a guy. As you can see, and as mentioned, I'm having to go back over a lot of these lines, and that's not ideal. I end up wasting a lot of time that could have been better spent elsewhere, and had I just committed when I first made them, this wouldn't be a problem. This approach to drawing is reminiscent of how I would draw when I was a kid. There's nothing inherently wrong with it. I'm sure it's widely used by plenty of competent artists, but maybe that's just it. I'm not using it purposefully or competently. I'm using it as kind of a sneaky way into the drawing. And what's worse, it's not any more efficient. At least when you think about someone sketching before getting into the final work, they're quickly getting down the essence of the thing. They're focused on gestures and general outlines, at least that's my understanding of it. But here I am making the whole thing with these light marks all the way through. It's unacceptable, simply unacceptable. I promise you and me that this will stop. If I'm going to use light lines like this, may they be for understanding the essence and exploring the scene as a whole, not whatever this is. I'm really over it. Before we finish up, I wanted to mention that I'm eager to implement some more single subject references. I was looking back at some of the first few videos and how they were pretty broad. There was a variety that I haven't noticed has been slipping away in the past few weeks. I've included some organic stuff here and there, along with the odd, bicycle or plant or whatever. But I am seeing a lot of architecture. In a city, it's obviously difficult to get away from buildings and whatnot, but I'd like to make more of an effort at injecting a little bit more variety back into this process. I really loved yesterday's reference due to, yes, it's architecture, but the scene as a whole is what I found captivating. I want to keep doing things like that because it's what I would like to eventually be really good at, but I don't want to get too caught up in only pretty old town views when I could and really should be drawing a more diverse selection of subjects. Some potted plants would be nice. Maybe I'll throw in a boat, some cafe paraphernalia, maybe a fountain, who knows. I noticed today that this scene, while a favorite of mine, relies on its composition, which is something I'm really hammering right now, but lacks in its depth, its contrast, and shape, rectangles and triangles notwithstanding. I'm always finding that balance between photography and drawing is a difficult one. In a lot of ways, they're too connected. Like I said, I've made this into a photo many times. So I'm usually failing at pulling the other direction. I don't really want to take a photo of a flower or a cup or whatever, but I actually really do want to draw those things. I just end up not because I'm so, locked into my photographic mindset that when I see something nice, I think, oh, well, there's a drawing I could do, when in actuality, it would make for a better photo. It all just comes back to finding the right references. In Tallinn, the architecture is just going to be a significant piece, which I will largely embrace, honestly, but I'm going to try to keep myself in check. I can't be too distracted by the pretty buildings, or all I will have drawn by the end of this is towers and facades. As pretty as they are, that can't be all that I do. So this is me telling you that there will be other things. Expect that potted plant before long. Okay, well, this one isn't a favorite of mine, but I like it a little bit more than I did immediately after drawing it. I think the angles are kind of fun. That light blue building actually turned out the best, oddly enough. And, well, yeah, it's pretty rough. Also, I'm not sure why I decided to shade in the bottom right building at the last second, but whatever. Let's ignore that. What do you think? Let me know in the comments and subscribe to the channel. I appreciate you for taking the time to watch this one, and I'll see you tomorrow. Thanks.